We regulate respiratory rate and the depthness of each breath to maintain homeostasis. Control of respiration occurs through both contraction and through involuntary breathing with some degree of control or voluntary effects. The involuntary breathing occurs due to respiratory regulators through actually pacemaker type cells found within the pons in the medulla. Okay, and we're going to take a look at that, whereas voluntary involves the cerebral cortex, the decision to do that. Here's how it works. We're trying to maintain homeostasis, and primarily what we're trying to regulate is blood oxygen levels, blood carbon dioxide levels, and pH of the blood. I've mentioned this previously. I'm going to remind you that carbon dioxide will dissociate. It'll combine with water to produce carbonic acid, which will then dissociate to produce a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. And so hydrogen ions are part of this regulatory process. Okay. There are chemoreceptors present in the body. We have a set of chemoreceptors that are found in the medulla oblongata, and we call these the central or medullary chemoreceptors. We also have a set of chemoreceptors in the aortic and carotid bodies, and these chemoreceptors, remember our sensory nervous system when we talked about chemoreceptors, their job is to detect chemicals present in the blood, and it just so happens that the chemicals that they are monitoring are hydrogen ions, carbon dioxide gas, and oxygen gas. In response to the signals that they receive, to the information they detect, they send a signal to the medulla oblongata. And based on the information carried on that signal, the medulla oblongata, together with the pons, will determine the appropriate respiratory rate. Will determine the appropriate respiratory rate. We'll send that information through the spinal cord to the lungs, to cause the motor neurons in the respiratory muscles to contract faster or slower depending on what our goals actually are, what we're trying to accomplish. Now, our cerebral cortex can decide, we can decide, our conscious thought occurs due to in the cerebral cortex. We can decide to inhale more deeply. We're tired, big yawn. We are bored, big sigh. Doctor says take a deep breath. We do it. We want to dive deep and stay underwater and hold our breath really long, so we're going to hyperventilate before we do that. All of those would be under control of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex has the ability to manipulate respiratory rate. You can even hold your breath, until you turn blue and pass out. But it's not an indefinite control. At some point, the involuntary processes will assume control, because we can't allow, obviously, if we don't have oxygen, we're in trouble. And so we can't allow homeostasis to be disrupted for too long without there being serious consequences. Now, the primary driver for respiratory rate happens to be carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a waste product. However, it's also very, very important because it's part of the bicarbonate buffer system that regulates blood pH. Here's the chemical equation that I've mentioned earlier and that I want you to practice and know well. If we take carbon dioxide in its gas form, combine it with water in liquid form, we're going to get this carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is a weak acid, and therefore it quickly will dissociate into hydrogen ions, and this bicarbonate ion. Because of the quickness of it dissociating, you can actually memorize, and I'm completely fine with you using just this equation. This is fine. Okay? You can actually memorize this shorthand equation, which essentially just doesn't list the intermediate step with carbonic acid being the intermediate step. This chemical reaction is completely reversible. Okay, completely reversible. And that matters. That matters. Because carbon dioxide is not the only source, not at all the only source of acid. We also have things like lactic acid and various other acids that are produced by skeletal muscles and working tissues. And so if we have an accumulation, so lactic acid is also going to contribute some hydrogen ions. And maybe perhaps we have these other sources of hydrogen ions. As they begin to accumulate within the system, our system, those hydrogen ions are going to bind to the bicarbonate ion, which will actually push the chemical reaction in this direction, and will end up producing more carbon dioxide and more water, of course, but it's the carbon dioxide that I'm interested in. Conversely, if we happen to, let's say our muscles are working their butts off and they produce a lot of carbon dioxide, we've got all this carbon dioxide accumulating because we've got cellular respiration on overdrive. Well, that carbon dioxide, as it accumulates, will push the chemical reaction in this direction and will end up producing more hydrogen ions. Okay. The hydrogen ions change pH. And if pH is changed too much, we have some serious issues, because we have enzymes, everything proteins, right? Even DNA and RNA can be affected and altered by hydrogen ions. And so as these accumulate, our enzymes stop working well, okay? And in extreme cases, denature. An accumulation of hydrogen ions can quickly become fatal if we don't compensate for it. Conversely, too few hydrogen ions, which means our blood is basic or alkaline, can also be problematic and harmful. Our blood pH on average is maintained at about 7.4. Now, arterial blood usually is in the range of pH of 7.36 is pretty typical. Whereas venous blood is usually at a pH of about 7.44 or 4.5. And so there is a range there. But on average, it comes out to be about 7.4. And that's really the value that I want you to learn. Anything that is higher than 7.4 is alkaline. Anything that is lower than 7.4 is acidic. Don't forget that the higher concentration, so high concentration of hydrogen ions results in so let's do an arrow. High concentration of hydrogen ions means that we are going to have a low pH value, right? Think of stomach acid, a pH of 1 or 2, and a very high concentration of hydrogen ions. Conversely, a low concentration of hydrogen ions, or alternatively, a high concentration of a base, like we'll just say OH negative, okay, will result in a pH that's high. Okay, so make sure you're comfortable with that too. Even after all these years, and I know darn good and well that Low pH means more hydrogen ions, and high pH means fewer hydrogen ions. I know that. But even still, when I speak and if I'm talking too fast and not thinking, I sometimes mix it up. So double check yourself on the exams to make sure you are not accidentally mixing it up just because you're going too fast, if that makes sense. Now, the loss of homeostasis, very problematic. Fortunately for us, and remembering what I talked about earlier about equations, if carbon dioxide levels go down, so if I decrease my carbon dioxide levels, okay, I'm going to draw the equation in this direction. And that means I'm going to get rid of hydrogen ions. Okay? And consequently, if my chemical reaction proceeds to the left, then my pH is going to increase. So if proceeds left, pH increases because we're removing hydrogen ions. The opposite is true. If we proceed right, then we're going to decrease the pH, okay, based on this equation. Now, how on earth do we get rid of the carbon dioxide? Well, I really hope by now you understand that we simply exhale it. We exhale it with each expiration. We remove it from our body with each expiration. And so, if I have too much hydrogen ion, if my pH is too low, I can correct the problem by removing carbon dioxide more rapidly or more efficiently. And we've already talked about two ways that we can do this. We can bronchodilate. Boom, that makes it a lot easier to exhale the carbon dioxide. And or we can increase our respiratory rate, which I'm just going to use RR for right now. So that's pretty cool. Our respiratory system is very effective at regulating blood pH. We do have some help from the renal system, and we are going to talk about the renal system in more detail, of course, when we get to the renal system. The renal system assists with regulating blood pH by removing extra hydrogen ions or by just through the urine. We urinate it out. Our urine can fluctuate in pH quite dramatically. It's very common, for example, to have a pH of, say, 6 if your blood acidity is too high. We can also have a pH of 8 if your blood is too alkaline. Okay? And it's due to the excretion, to removing hydrogen ions from the body through the urine. Or we could remove bicarbonate ion through the urine, or we could keep the bicarbonate ion, or we could keep the hydrogen ions. And it simply depends on what the pH is. Now we have a slow versus fast. The renal system is relatively slow compared to the respiratory system. And by relative, I'm really talking, it takes, well, I guess it depends on whether you have tiny bladder syndrome or not. But, it can take a few hours to fill the bladder with urine and effectively remove the hydrogen ions. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. So these two are partnered, and generally speaking, it's about 70-30 split in terms of which system is more important to regulating pH, with the respiratory system being the 70.